Hi. Today we're going to talk about what we can learn from watching an actual play group, specifically the Glass Cannon podcast. They've been doing an OSR style Shadowdark campaign since October. Now, people watch actual play for entertainment. The cast is funny, the story is engaging, all that kind of stuff. But for us as game masters, it's also an opportunity to learn. So that's the lens through which we'll talk about the Glass Cannon today. What can we learn as game masters? We'll talk about their campaign style, how they use the rules, what do the players do, what do the referees do, and more specifically, I'll cover all those things I've picked up watching their channel and what I'm going to incorporate into my own games to get better. Welcome. I'm John. I'm a longtime game master. My channel is a place I like to talk about Shadowdark and old school D&D, and my goal is to help people become better referees and grow our hobby. And the theme of today's episode is learning, and I realized that the act of putting videos together, like doing a deep dive on these tools and techniques, actually helps me become a much better referee in my home games. And if becoming a better referee sounds good to you, please consider subscribing to my channel. You won't miss my videos and you'll help me grow. Thank you. So the first question is, what is the Glass Cannon podcast? How can you find them? What are they all about? I'll put a link down below on how to find their YouTube channel. They are an actual play group that seems like they've been together 10, 11 years. In the past, they've done Call of Cthulhu and Pathfinder, and their current campaign is based on Shadowdark. The cast consists of Troy, the referee, and the players include Skid, Sydney, Kate, Matthew, and Joe. They're about 20 sessions into the current campaign. And if you're familiar with Shadowdark, you're going to know what their campaign is based on. Way back in Curse Scroll 1, there was a setting here called the Gloaming. And so they're using that as the foundation for the campaign. And I'm sure that over time, Troy, the referee, is going to incorporate additional dungeons and adventures as necessary. Now, the structure of each of their episodes, it starts with a short vignette, either sketch comedy or maybe a behind-the-scenes chat with one of the cast members. They do 10, 15 minutes of recap and small talk as everyone settles in, and then they probably play for about an hour to an hour and 15 minutes each session. So each week is a bite-sized chunk. It's easy to fit into your schedule. I mentioned the goal of today is learning, and specifically what can we learn from an actual play. And I would say first, you have to start with an open mind, some kind of a growth mindset. Be an empty cup, as they say. Be willing to learn from other folks. Being a referee is putting yourself on a path of lifelong learning. If you think about all the different things you have to do as a referee, from creative writing, like building your campaign, the adventures, writing NPCs, drawing, you might do cartography and mapping. And then at the table, there's performance, there's bringing all these characters and situations to life, and mastery of the rules. It's a lot. People learn through repetition. So by being a game master and doing it a lot, you'll learn. You can push yourself into new areas and stretch and do new things at the table. Go play with someone else, play with someone more experienced and see how they do things. And that's really where the gift of actual play comes in, because you can invite an experienced game master into your home office or living room or wherever you take in the content. And the thing about an expert, like watching an expert performance, is that it's going to hold up a mirror to your own style and give you something to reflect on what you do and what you could do differently or better. Last thing, how I referee today is not the same as what I did 6 months ago or 9 months ago, which is not the same as how I was a referee 5 years ago or even 10 years ago. Think of yourself as being on this journey where you're constantly going to be making small marginal improvements along the way. Let's switch gears and start talking about what we can learn from the Glass Cannon. And I'm going to start with their campaign style. So they're doing the gloaming, which is a hex crawl, which means that starting at first level, their players have set out from some of their strongholds and gone on these epic jaunts, traversing completely across the gloaming hex crawl. And this was probably the single most life-changing learning moment for me watching their show. To explicate the point, we may need to step back a little bit. First off, how many people out there like me started refereeing back in the 1980s? I know my audience has newer people, but there's probably some grognards out there too. If you started in the 80s, chances are you're familiar with like the Moldve Cook Basic Expert set that came out right at the beginning of the 1980s or like the middle of the 1980s, had this, the red box and the blue box. Thing that both those basic Dungeons and Dragons sets had in common back in the day is a clear distinction between what they called basic play and expert play. And basic play was for levels 1 to 3. It involved going into that local dungeon not far from the hometown. And expert play is when you started wilderness adventures and it was delayed until level 4 or later. Part of it was that the wilderness was more complicated, but mainly it was just a lot more dangerous for low-level player characters. And I didn't realize this, but I'd been carrying this around as a mental model for 40 years. Like, what does a good D&D campaign look like? It starts with one of those small local dungeons, and then after a couple levels, you transition into wilderness hexcrawl. And now here comes the Glass Cannon. And we've got these first level characters leaving Marin's Hold in like their very first game session, going completely across the gloaming. I felt this great sense of stress. Like, why are they doing that? You don't do that until you're expert levels. But yet that's how Shadowdark's designed, and that's how a lot of these hex crawls are designed for players to start experiencing the wilderness at low levels. And I really had to sort of unlearn how I thought about campaigns. How does that work? First level characters are going into a wilderness where they're going to run into trolls and giants and dragons that are things that are way beyond their capabilities. We're going to talk about that a little bit down below in the referee style. You really have to master the ability to telegraph danger and another technique, which I'm going to call danger substitution. But I am already good at those, so I'm confident I can do it. This is probably the biggest learning for me, and it has me resolved whenever one of my current campaigns get over is to start fresh with one of these Shadowdark style hex crawls and push the players out into the wilderness right at level 1. The next thing is their amazing map. So here's what the original gloaming map looks like, and it's done in very much a black and white OSR style, like a lot of things in Shadowdark. The Glass Cannon folks, they've rendered this beautiful version of the gloaming. They're running it on their Foundry virtual tabletop. And then what they've done for actual hex crawling is they've got this cool hand-drawn token to represent the players, and as they're moving around the map, when they come adjacent to a point of interest, there's a reveal moment where we now see what the point of interest is on top of the map. It's really well done. I don't use Foundry. My home games are running in Roll20, but I'm already starting to think about how I could do the same technique in Roll20. The one thing I'm resolved to up my map game, go back to, more of a beautiful high-res map. I like making maps anyway. The Glass Cannon folks have inspired me. The next observation is that they're using theater of the mind for dungeons and combat. Shadowdark uses abstract distances like close, near, and far, which lend itself to a theater of the mind style. It means combat moves very quickly. We don't have to follow along on a grid or with tokens or anything like that. So it probably plays well for people just listening to the podcast audio as well. I already do theater of the mind in my home game, so this is less of a learning and more of just an observation that I think it's working well for them. What about their use of the rules? What can we learn about the mechanics they're using at the table? For the most part, they're very light on house rules. The biggest change from how most people probably run their home game is that they've adopted something called pulp mode. And let me put pulp mode up on the screen here. It mainly influences luck tokens. It means that everybody starts a session with a luck token. You can have more than one, and players can spend them interactively on more things than just a reroll. They can upgrade a crit, or they can upgrade an ordinary hit to a critical, and they can also spend one to force the referee to make the referee's roll with disadvantage. They've modified pulp mode slightly. They've put a cap that players can't have more than 3 luck tokens, and they don't get 1 to 3 per game session. They get 1 at the start of each game session. So a couple things. One, this has reduced the lethality of the game a little bit. It gives the players a little bit more survivability, particularly because if there's a critical attack coming their way, they can choose to downgrade the referee's effectiveness. And that's probably a good thing for an actual play. You want more survivability, so there's continuity amongst the characters. The other thing, though, it's desensitized me a little bit to luck tokens. I've come to realize that on one level, it almost doesn't matter how much the players have because they're going to spend them anyway. And when they really need luck tokens for a tense, dramatic moment, they're not going to be there. So I did a social experiment with my players, and I started giving out more luck tokens during the sessions. And I realized when the chips were down and they're fighting the boss or something terrible is going to happen, they all looked around at each other and they didn't have luck tokens. It's kind of like my teenager. I'd give him allowance, like be like, all right, I'm transferring the money. Then look, what? 0? How did you spend it that quickly? Players use their luck tokens the way my teenager spends their allowance. The personal takeaway for me is I learned to stop worrying about luck tokens so much and realize that, yeah, the game is still going to have these tense, dramatic moments where consequences matter. What can we learn from the players and what the players are doing at the table? Most of this comes down to the player style. First, they stay in character most of the game, which is nice. They limit the out of character talk, like table talk stuff. And I've also noticed they do a good job of limiting their metagaming. You can sense that most of them have probably an improv theater background because they tend to argue like improvisers. What I mean is that it's okay to have strong characters, but to work together and find a way to move a scene forward. The players really seem to be enjoying the OSR style. It lets them tinker and experiment and reward out of the box thinking. They do a good job of honoring elements of Shadowdark's core ethos, things like taking the torch seriously and resource management, worrying about food and water and things like that. When I think about the player style, it's less about maybe learnings than just admiring what they do. And actually, I will say this. Maybe at some point in the future, I could imagine challenging my players to try more of an in-character night, which is not something we do very often. Anyway, I enjoy the Glass Cannon Troupe. They're fun to watch, and they do a good job. So what have I learned from Troy and watching his referee style? Well, first let's talk about some high points during the season. And I see them on two different like sides of the pendulum, highly scripted versus improvised. And let's talk about the highly scripted moment first. There was a time pretty early in the series, I want to say episodes 6 and 7, where the player characters had discovered a fairy ring and received an invitation to come back during the full moon and partake of kind of a fairy party where Titania and her court entered the mortal world and put on some kind of a performance and play. And the players experienced that. It was extremely well done. Troy's narrative and the different vignettes and scenes the players engaged in pulled us into this mystical otherworld for a little while that felt like something out of A Midsummer Night's Dream or Neil Gaiman's Sandman or something like that. And there was a good blend of exposition and interacting with fairy characters, as well as the players themselves getting to make choices and do some interaction. That's an example of how a referee could create what I perceived as kind of a highly scripted set piece that transports the game and players to like this fairy otherworld. So great job. On the far other end of the spectrum, okay, let's talk about carousing. Recently, I want to say maybe episode 16 or 17, somewhere around there, the players finally returned home after spending like the first 15 episodes wandering the forsaken wilderness of the Gloaming, and they get their first chance to go carousing. And most of the time when I've done carousing, it's very much a mechanical affair. Players spend the money, we roll on the table. Maybe there's a little bit of role playing about the aftermath after announcing the results, like here's where you find yourself and here's what happened. But what they did on the Glass Cannon podcast is they rolled and Troy didn't announce anything. He didn't tell the players what happened. Instead, it immediately kicked off a scene that started at the beginning of the night with the player characters. And an improvised scene took them through what happened that ended in those results on the carousing table. And it was only after it was fully resolved that Troy said, hey, you got like 4 experience points and blah, 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 like whatever the results were. An example would be like a priest ally. And even then, when I've done it in my home game, I've given the person the name of a priest, they wrote it down, and they think of it as, oh, if I need a favor, this is someone I can circle back to when I need a favor at some point in the future. They actually did a whole role-playing scene with this priest who then became kind of a hanger-on and a sidekick, a little bit of an irritating character. And it's just very charming. That whole experience of improvising, carousing end to end was definitely like a kind of an open my mind experience to where I was like, wait, I want to do that. I need to try that sometime. So now I've resolved to do an improvised carousing at some point in the future. Okay, so that's Troy's style, the highly scripted versus the highly improvised, and some takeaways for our own games. The other thing to talk about is how do you manage these first level characters going out into the dangers of the hex crawl? And there's 2 techniques I've seen Troy do effectively. The first is telegraphing danger. And listen, I've talked about this on this channel several times. It's a really important skill for an OSR referee. We don't fixate on things like game balance, but what we do say is to be fair, to be impartial, to be neutral. We should give the players enough information so that they can make good decisions, and telegraphing danger is part of it. A good example here, I don't remember what episode it was, but the players end up stumbling on this huge hole in the ground and something horrible lives down in the hole. I don't want to spoil it too much, but the players, their smells, there's this rumbling deep beneath the ground. There's wisps of smoke coming out of the ravine, and they make the right connection. The danger is telegraphed, and and they make the smart choices about it. They had an encounter with a troll that was similar, or a pack of wild boars at some point. The other technique, though, I'm going to call it danger substitution. An example of how that works is this. So the players at one point, they stumble into an area where there's a cave. Now, it's a werewolf cave. They're first level characters. They have no silver. They don't have enough magic to fight a werewolf, but they persist in wanting to go into this cave and explore. So the first time they go in, the werewolf's not home. So they get to see what the lair is and how dangerous it is, without all of the consequences of like blundering into a werewolf at level 1. And Troy does this a couple times over the course of the season. I think it's a good technique. It could be controversial because if you overuse it, you run the risk of the players kind of being let off the hook or not facing consequences of poor choices. But used, I think, in the right amount, it's similar to telegraphing danger in that it gives players the information they need to make smarter choices in the future. So I think substituting danger, it's probably a really good technique to do it once for each encounter type. And then if the players persist, let them deal with the consequences of some of their choices. So are there some areas where I would be critical of the Glass Cannon folks and what they're doing? Yes. The biggest area is rules. They're not very strong with the rules, neither the players or the referees. Like they miss pretty basic stuff. It was weeks before they realized that Magic Missile grants advantage, for instance. I still don't think the thief has figured out the right way to do backstab and backstab damage dice. The fighter, I don't think they've ever employed grit on any of their strength stuff. Orcs don't have infravision or dark vision, things like that. Now, to extend some grace to them, I think part of this is how they film. I think that they do things in batches. So if they sit down and film like a 3 or 4 episode sequence all in one day, and they start the day with a certain rules interpretation, that's going to carry through for all 3 or 4 episodes. And so there's a big break before they get a chance to reflect and realize, oh, you know what? I don't think we were doing that right. Whereas for us, for our home games, we play Sunday night. During the week, either the referee or the players, they have an epiphany. And they're like, you know what? I don't think we were doing this right. We get to correct it the very next game session. So the way they're doing their filming, I don't think they have the opportunity to do that. But here is a question for viewers, a philosophical question. Who's responsible for knowing the rules inside and out? Do you guys draw a line between game master stuff and referee stuff? Or do you assume that, hey, the referee should know everything and part of their job is reminding their players on the right way to do stuff? I tend to hold the referee accountable because I hold myself accountable. I do a lot of convention games, so I'm always in this mode where I'm teaching new people or making sure that they really understand their options and choices while running the game. So maybe this is just me, but I expect the referee to be the expert. The other critical area for these guys is to recognize that theater of the mind doesn't mean no maps. There's been a few times where players get confused about positioning and stuff like that. So you've really got 2 choices. Either you create a very clear shared mental image of what the virtual battle map or scene is, so that everyone has a clear picture of what's going on and where they are, even if it's theater of the mind. Or you just bust out a piece of paper or a whiteboard, or even use a map to help with visualization. Again, not a huge thing. I haven't really had problems following along, but I think that could make it a little clearer, especially for some of the players there. Okay, so where are we at? Let's summarize the takeaways. For me, the number one thing was dropping that mental model of basic versus expert and really thinking about what the joy could be of having first level player characters heading out into a tense wilderness, uh, and how suspenseful that would be, and getting a chance to work on referee skills like telegraphing danger or substituting danger within limits. I think that's going to be great fun, and I'm looking forward to doing that in a future campaign. I mentioned that Glass Cannon showed me how to raise the bar on hex crawl maps. Oof, I got to do better. I've learned to chill out on luck tokens a little bit. I'm more generous giving them out at the beginning of a session, knowing that the players will never conserve them. They spend them like my teenager and his allowance. And by the end of the session, when they really need them, things are tense. The drama's always going to be there. I pointed out how we can invest in really developing some otherworldly set pieces that elevate the game for a session, like Troy's Fairy World. And then the last thing was, oh, how creative and fun it looked to improvise all that carousing. Something I really want to try. Okay, how about you? What if you've been watching Glass Cannon? What's really stood out at you, and what have you learned from watching them that you want to incorporate into your own game? That's it for today. Thanks for making it this far, and I'll be back soon.